Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel, and I have a very special guest, Lindy of Lindy's Magpie Reads, and she'll be doing most of the talking today. This is our annual video. That's kind of a reaction video to the Scotiabank Giller Prize, which is Canada's most lucrative literary prize. And I don't follow Canadian literature nearly as much as Lindy does. So the title of this video is something like Lindy schooled Shawn on the Giller Prize. And I don't know very much about the long list. I have some opinions about some of the omissions, but I don't know very much about what's on here. And so that's what Lindy's going to do for me and for y'all. Lindy, welcome.
Thank you, Shawn. It's good to be here.
I wore your favorite blouse.
Yes, I love those daisies. And with your blouse acumen in mind, I put on a flowered outfit as well. This is one that I dyed myself with impressions of flowers from my garden.
And it really resonates. Can I use that word? Resonates with one of Laurie's paintings on the wall behind you.
Ah, yeah, well,
Yeah,
lots of color in her work.
yeah. So I wore your favorite blouse to kind of ingratiate myself with you, so you wouldn't, I'm willing to be schooled, but I don't really want to be scolded for how little I know about the long list. So with that in mind, shall we get going? What is the Giller, Lindy?
So this is the 30th year of the Giller Literature Prize. And as you mentioned, it's Canada's foremost literary prize because it has such a large purse, I think. And it's always a big splash when it's announced, the long list, the short list, and the winner. The other, I would say, major literary prize in Canada is the Governor General Awards. They have a lot of different categories, but the prize purse is smaller, though it still has a lot of esteem, I would say. And then now there's a
What are we
new,
talking about? Purse size to purse size?
oh, well, it's $25,000 for the
Or
winner of the Governor General's and
and so
100,000 for the Giller. Yeah.
okay, well that's quite a difference.
And then there's the new prize that you are very familiar with, and that is the Carol Shields a prize. But that one is joint U.S. and Canadian authors, so
Yes,
it's not
that's
strictly Canadian.
that's for women and non-binary writers. Yeah. And so if you have been following the Giller Prize since its inception, that means you started following it in primary school, but have you?
No, I haven't. I am really interested in Canadian literature, and sometimes titles on the Giller list have attracted me, sometimes not. But in more recent years, I think this is the fourth year that I'm actually shadowing the Giller. So I've been doing this project with some other readers where we read as much Canadian literature as possible and either try and predict or come up with our wish list of titles that we want to see on the long list. And then we've agreed that once the short list is announced, we'll read all of those books and come up with our choice for a winner before the official winner is announced. Just a fun project to get us reading a variety of Canadian literature.
And I think at least one year in the past, we called this video the Shadow Knows Lindy School Shawn. Yes, that's right. So if I can, I'm going to ask you for hopefully just a one word reaction or a short phrase reaction to the long list this year.
I'm excited by this long list. Yeah,
Okay.
I think there's a lot of titles that I'm interested in reading. I have read 4 of them already, and I'd say I'm happy to see them there. We can talk about omissions maybe at the end.
At the end, absolutely. And you put out not a prediction video, but a wish list. How many of those ended up here?
3.
Three. Oh, 3 of the 4 that you've
Mhm.
read they were made on here. Okay. Or no, 3 of the 4. So one of the 4 that you didn't that you did read, you didn't want to see on the list. So I want to know what that is. But let's get into what's actually on the list. And the first one is by a writer that I remember you being lukewarm about in the past, and that's David Bergen, and his novel is called Away from the Dead. Oh,
I do not want to read anything by David Bergen again because I had such.
oh, so I think more than lukewarm or less than lukewarm. What would that be? Anyway, it's more of
I'm
adverse, more
I'm
negative,
hot.
hot in a bad way.
Yes. Yes. Now this is the third time, I think, third or fourth time that David Bergen has been on the Giller list of
And
in
didn't
some
he win one
form.
year? I think he
He
won
did
once.
win for, I think it's called The Time Between, which is set in Vietnam. It's a novel which I did not read because I got bad vibes just reading about it, that it is a soldier, Canadian soldier who was in the Vietnam War, goes back 3 decades later and then disappears, and his offspring go looking for him in Vietnam. And the description of the book, so maybe the book is better than the description, but the description emphasizes the mysterious East. And it just sounded so othering that it just didn't sound like my kind of book.
Colonial BS.
Yes, colonial. And then because of the Shadow Giller project, his collection of short stories, Hear the Dark, was one that I did read. And I wrote a rant about that collection, which we can link to in the description box.
Yeah, I was quite
I don't
proud
want
of you
to
for
go.
that rant.
I don't want to go into it again and give him more time. But basically, it's his writing is technically admirable. It's the content that I find offensive. And these short stories were so much about the white male gaze. They just put me right off. So
Well, and
this
funny that
current,
he's the only white man on the list. There's only two men on the list, and he's the only white guy, and enough said, maybe.
the story Away from the Dead is set in Ukraine at the beginning of the 20th century, I think, Bolshevik times.
Yes.
And I really hope it doesn't make the short list. I don't want to read it.
Well, the author of Away from the Dead is dead to Lindy. So the next one I know you're very passionate about, and this is the Marmitiest book that's maybe been published this year. Sarah Bernstein's Study for Obedience.
Yes. So when this appeared on the Booker long list, it was the title that caught my interest the most, not only because Sarah Bernstein is Canadian, but the way that the book was described. I thought that sounds like my kind of book, that it's about the writing and the use of language, and that it's experimental. And I went out and bought myself a copy, and I loved it. Yes.
Yes, I knew that Eric Carl Anderson bailed on it, and it's probably the biggest event on BookTube this year. Eric Carl Anderson never bails, but I watched part of his video. I watched more of it this morning. But you sold me on at least giving it a try myself, because you were really quite enamored of it.
Yeah, so I like an original voice and a distinctive voice. And this is in the voice of a young woman who has moved to another country, unnamed, to help out her eldest brother after his wife and kids leave him. And it's kind of preposterous and very fable-like in feeling, even though it's a contemporary setting. You can tell by the details. But a lot of it is mysterious. And I like a puzzle of a book, especially when there's a really playful style. So it's funny and also ominous, because she's in a situation where the village people are really antagonistic towards her.
If I got this right, that their hostility is based on anti-Semitism.
That is correct. Yes. So there's layers of a whole span of history and how, in this case, Jewish people were persecuted. But also it's from a personal level and her feelings about what's happening with the villagers, but also within her family and how she was treated in her family and is currently being treated by her brother. And the way that exterior beliefs affect how we feel about ourselves. So being inside that experience, I think, is really well shown in this novel. Yeah. But it's not a novel where a bunch of stuff happens. So if you're going for plot, this is probably not a book for you.
Well, and I don't usually go in for too much plot. So yeah, I will at least give it a try. I think the next one is a big plotty book, and also one you're very passionate about, if I'm remembering correctly. Eleanor Catton's Burnham Wood.
Yes. Yeah. So this one, I think that the description doesn't do it justice, because I've seen it advertised as an ecological thriller. And it does get thriller-esque right towards the very end, but the majority of the book is a very slow burn, getting to know a large cast of characters, are mostly people who are a guerrilla gardening group in New Zealand. Very ideal
gardening group. So
they're growing food on land that's otherwise not being used. They don't necessarily have permission. That's the guerrilla part. The idealism of these people is something that causes clashes. They have, lots of meetings where people have lots of ideas and take strong stances. And the dialogue around all of that is excellent. She's really nailed the kind of high-minded, high-handed attitudes of people who say that this is the right way to live. And then we have a contrast with somebody who's sort of Elon Musk-ish.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, so much stuff happening that has to do with characterization.
And lots of people don't like this novel also because they say nothing really happens until the last 100 pages or something.
Well, if you want the pace to stay the same through an entire novel, then this is not the book for you. I kind of like a big splashy crash at the end of a book. It's like, wow, that was impressive. So this worked for me.
Big splashy crash. That's a lovely phrase. I'll try to give you one at the end of this video, Lindy. A big splashy crash. How's that?
Okay, yeah, I'm waiting for it.
Now, the next one is maybe the only one on the list or the one that I'm the most interested to try, probably the one that I would try first. Kevin Chong's The Double Life of Benson Yu.
Okay, so this is interesting. I'm excited that it's here, but I have to tell you, I had it out from the library a couple months ago and started reading it and decided I was not in the right frame of mind for it. There's all this business because we're moving to a different province and all that. And I sent it back to the library and I was like, not just that it's on the Giller Longlist, but prior to that, I heard Kevin Chong interviewed on the next chapter. And after listening to what he had to say, I was already regretting having sent it back too soon. I'm looking forward to reading this. It's metafictional with the adult character in the novel talking to his younger self.
Tell us about the author.
All I know is that he lives in Vancouver.
I'm going to do my best to pronounce this author's name. I think I can do it. Nina Dunich. And her novel is called The Clarion.
This was not on my radar at all, although I had seen it on the Craving Can-Lit carousel on the Giller website. There's a list of all these eligible Canadian titles, more than the 145 that the judges read, because it's pretty much everything that is possibly eligible, not necessarily what the publishers submitted. Because there is a limit. Each publisher is allowed to submit one title or two if they have previously had something on the Giller list, the long list. I think they might even be able to submit three if one of the books is by somebody who has previously won. Maybe that's why David Bergen keeps going on the list. I don't know.
I think so. There's got to be some reason.
Yeah, well, and I don't know. I guess he's a good writer. He's
they just need
15 books. We just have very different viewpoints. So the cover is not necessarily prepossessing.
No, there's nothing. But the story sounded interesting.
What I read the first chapter. I went out and got the book since the long list, and it starts out with a scene where there's a trumpet sitting on a table, and then I realized, oh, that's what's on the cover. Portion of a trumpet.
I think the reason there's a trumpet on the cover is because one of the main characters plays a trumpet.
Yeah, so there's Peter who plays the trumpet and his sister Stacy.
Yeah, that sounded interesting to me, that the two main characters were a brother and sister, adult brother and sister. So,
and the other thing that attracted me is that how it's described. So sometimes this is deceiving, but on the back cover of this book, it's described as being in the literary tradition of Mavis Gallant and Alice Munro.
Well, you see me pricking up my ears. Those comparisons sometimes, when they flop, when they don't come true for me, I get angry, but that certainly sounds intriguing. The next novel is, I'm going to do my best. I think the author's name would be pronounced Aram Fazia Hassan, and her novel is called We Meant Well. That's quite a lovely title for a novel, I think. We Meant Well.
Yes, and this is probably the one that I was most enthusiastic about that I hadn't read yet. And I immediately went and got a copy. It is about a woman who's involved in a charity project in some other continent, can't remember where. And she gets a phone call in the middle of the night that one of the project partners has been accused of some kind of misconduct. And so she has to go there and sort out what's happening with this charity. And so the issues of Western world, helping in other countries, just all of those complicated relationships really captured my interest as soon as I learned about the premise of this book.
Did you already say this is a debut?
It is a debut. I didn't say it.
It is a debut.
That's right. I know nothing about the author, but this copy has got a blurb from C.S. Richardson on the cover.
Who's on this long list.
And Richardson is on the long list. So, yeah, well, the Canadian literary world is pretty small.
Well, for me, blurbs on books by other authors are the equivalent of hostage videos. So that's my last comment on blurbs from authors. I watched booktubers stalking Kafka about the long list, and I got the impression there was a whole pile of short story collections on here. But now that I look here, there's only two that are identified on the Giller website as being short story collections, and the next one is one of those. Dion Irving's The Islands.
This is one that I have read. I gave it 4 stars. I think it's
Oh,
good.
you've read it.
There's one story, the second from the end, I think it's called Gifts, that really stood out for me. The whole collection is about the Caribbean diaspora, actually specifically Jamaican diaspora. And the stories take place in a lot of different locations. Many of the characters are Jamaican Canadian. But for example, there's one Jamaican Panamanian Canadian, because in this story, Jamaican workers went to Panama to build the canal. And then in the mid-60s, with the American involvement there and the civil unrest, and there was tear gas. And so, because this character was a child at the time, as an adult, she has problems with her eyes. That's a long-term effect from the tear gas. So you really get a sense of what it's like to migrate to different parts of the world for work. The story Gifts that I like so much is about a young woman who goes to England from Jamaica and her experience working there for a family and becoming a mistress. There are several stories where they talk about children who are raised separate from their parents because their parents are earning money somewhere else. I'd say it's a strong collection. So I was just a little surprised to see it here, but I'm not opposed to it being on the long list.
Very interesting. And Kathryn Kuitenbrouwer has a novel called Wait Softly, Brother.
So again, this wasn't really on my radar, but I'm happy to see it here because the only book I've read by this author was her debut, and that was more than 10 years ago. It was a book called The Nettle Spinner. It was about tree planters and had folkloric allusions. And that's the kind of thing I like. And so I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to read another one of her books. From what I understand, it is about memory and how stories are passed along and how the way stories are passed along shapes us, something along those lines.
With some of the setting involves war, I believe.
Yeah, and family history.
Yes. So the family history is that one of the Canadian ancestors was originally, I don't know the circumstances through which this ancestor fought in the U.S. Civil War. That's the going way back in history. So that did sound quite interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Mm-hmm.
I want to read all these books, and I don't have any room on my reading calendar until next year, I don't think.
Well, that's okay. You don't have to read them now.
I'll be vicarious. I'll just read through you by osmosis. Menica Raman Wilms. Her novel is called The Rooftop Garden. Oh, yeah, this one sounded interesting too.
Yeah, I am always interested in a book that deals with ecological crisis, what we're going through right now. And the cat has come to say hello here. Cat has distracted me. I don't know much about this book aside from the description. And
the title is very much important in the two friends as kids used to play in the rooftop garden of the apartment building or whatever that they lived in. So that's where the title comes from. And then it gets, as they become adult, one of them is a researcher who studies seaweed in warming oceans, and then it gets very environmental. So it does sound very much like a Lindy book, I think.
Mm-hmm.
All the Color in the World by C.S. Richardson. And that's a man, C.S. Richardson. I stand corrected. There are three men on the long list.
And he is white.
So two white guys. And how do we feel about him, Lindy? or his
Okay.
book?
This was one of the ones that I had on my wish list. Yes.
Oh, okay, great.
And interestingly, when I first read it, I gave it 4 stars, but I just kept thinking about it, and it haunted me. It grew on me. It is the story of one man's life. So starting from childhood and into his full life, including his time spent as a soldier in the Second World War in Sicily, and how that affected him. And art was his solace through his whole life. And so for people who like ekphrasis, this is a good novel to look at. And his language is exquisite. Lots of lovely turns of phrase. It's lyrical and poetic in a condensed form, not a great big fat lush book, but short. Yeah, it's not a long book.
Oh, okay. And he lives in Toronto. Short story collection. We have never lived on Earth.
Kasia van Skyke is South African Canadian. I believe she came to Canada as a child, and I have started reading this collection. I've read the first 2 stories, and they are interconnected. So it's a collection of short stories that forms a novel, I would say. I'm guessing. They're certainly all about the same central character, who's called Charlotte Ferrier. And she's somebody who came from South Africa as a child to Canada. So perhaps drawing on the author's experiences. One of the stories that I read has a forest fire. It's set in BC, and I understand that there are other ecological disasters. It's part of the warming earth, kind of reflected also with the precariousness of being a woman in society today. So, yeah, it sounds great. It's put out by the University of Alberta Press.
I see that.
And
does she live in Edmonton or Alberta?
No, maybe she did at one point, but I think she's in Montreal.
No.
There are several smaller publishers on this list too, which we haven't mentioned specifically, but that's really nice to see.
Yes, I believe those small presses would be Goose Lane Editions, and that's the publisher of David Bergen. Invisible Publishing, I'd never heard of them, and that's Nina Dunich's The Clarion. ECW Press, the Hassan's We Meant Well. Catapult Press, don't know that one. The Jamaican short stories The Islands by Dion Irving. Is Woolsack and Wynn, is that a small press?
It is, yes.
Okay. They published the Kuitenbrouwer novel Wait Softly Brother. Nightwood Editions published Roman Wilms's The Rooftop Garden. And the rest of them are bigger publishers or university publishers.
Yeah, so that excites me too. I'm happy to see these smaller publishers on the list.
Yeah. And the final book on this list, how many of them are there, by the way? It looks like 12 or 13 or 14?
There's a total of 12.
12, okay. Is Deborah Willis, and her novel is called Girlfriend on Mars.
And this one, I've only read the sample on the publisher's website. So I have read a collection of her short stories before, Something About the Dark. I liked her writing. I can't remember anything about the short stories other than that. So the premise of this one is pretty interesting. A while back, there was this proposed trip to Mars, and this was a real thing. They were looking for people who would sign up to go on this rocket ship to Mars, one-way trip, and they needed volunteers. And that is the premise of this
One-way
novel.
trip, meaning there's no coming back.
At that time, and probably still, don't have the technology to return from Mars. But this was a proposed trip where people would use frozen water on Mars to create oxygen and I don't know, get
But they
started.
thought that they would survive. They would just live on Mars.
Yeah, yeah. And grow things hydroponically. The central character in this novel, from what I understand, is somebody who, with her boyfriend, was growing weed hydroponically. And so she has expertise. And it's I guess she signs up for a reality type show, and it's the top two people in the reality show that get chosen to go to Mars. I'm not sure. It sounds kind of fun, intriguing. And this is nothing to do with the contents, except that the titles of these last two books, they go well together. We Have Never Lived on Earth and Girlfriend on Mars.
Yeah, your challenge, should you choose to accept it, Lindy, is at some point before the shortlist is announced to make a spine poem. Spine poem. Some of these or all of these books. Okay, well, so, I can't sit on my reaction to what got excluded any longer. Can we get into that now?
Yes, yes. What are you disappointed not to see, Shawn?
Well, I am probably beyond disappointed. I'm outraged that there's no indigenous, there are no indigenous authored books on the long list, and there's several that have come out, and it's not like they're Thomas King, where okay, they've been awarded many things in the past. It's not because of that. It's because they're not that established of writers. But goodness, in the last 3 days, we've had new releases from Katherena Vermette has a new novel's just come out, and the author of Nishka, Jordan
Yeah.
Abel's first new novel just came out. You and I both have a copy of that, I think.
Oh, I haven't got my hands on a physical copy, but I want to read it. I definitely want.
Me
And,
too.
another book which I had on my wish list, and I'm surprised not to see it, is Michelle Porter's debut, A Grandmother Begins the Story. I thought that was
Yeah. And so many. I would say that if you haven't watched my channel, you might be surprised that I like to make blunt statements that, Lindy usually talks me down and says, Shawn, it's not that black and white. But I think that the only really exciting writing happening in Canada is Indigenous writing. So what the hell is going on with the fact that there's none of them on the Giller list? That just infuriates me. So
Well, just because they're not on the Giller list doesn't mean that these books aren't exciting and excellent. We can still be reading them and promoting them. And also, fingers crossed that they'll be recognized in the Governor General Awards.
okay. Yeah. And to me that begs the question, then what the hell is the Giller list for if they're not on there? It's obviously not for Indigenous writing in Canada.
Well, I think it just shows that there are many, many great books that are published in Canada. And there is an Indigenous juror on the Giller jury, Brian Thomas. So
That's
there's
true.
and I think they try every year to have an Indigenous writer as one of the jurors. So there's input there.
Another one of my controversial opinions is I'm not entirely sure that we need to be putting people on prize lists who haven't lived in Canada since 1932. And we've got at least two on here. And if they weren't eligible, there would be room for more Indigenous representation.
Yeah, yeah. Eleanor Catton was a baby when she left with her family.
Yeah.
She
And Sarah
just take off on
Bernstein
her
hasn't.
own, but yeah,
Yeah.
she's a New Zealand author, really. But those are the rules.
So in terms of who lives in who was here first or who is actually here compared to people that are only vaguely Canadian, I'm not sure about that. Okay, well, who's more Canadian than Indigenous writers? I mean,
And
uncomfortably
true.
Canadian, but
Yeah, yeah. I agree. that it's a shame that not even one single Indigenous writer is on this list. Last
This
year,
is
I think there were
incredible.
2 on the
Okay.
long list. Yeah.
So, Flash Ram finished. Who are you disappointed or by not being here, or what are your thoughts
Well,
on?
my top book last year and is eligible for the Giller because it was published after October 1st last year. And the time period is October 1st to September 30th. That's the time period for eligibility. The book is Fayne by Anne-Marie MacDonald.
Yes, you were a big fan of that.
Oh, good. I'm really, really surprised that it didn't make this long list.
Yeah, that's
So,
also a bit of a Marmite book. I know people that really disliked it quite actively. Thought it was plodding and way too long, and you loved it.
I did. All 700 and some pages of it.
I've certainly heard other good, really glowing reviews as well. So I was a big fan of her debut novel, Fall Down on Your Knees.
Fall on your knees. Yeah.
Fall on your
Yeah.
knees. Thank you.
Yeah. I still think about the characters in that book. And I read it many years ago.
So
Yeah.
remind us, when does the short list come out?
The short list is going to be announced on October the 11th.
Well, I'm going to be watching your channel like a hawk to see which one of these I should read, but I probably won't read any of them before the short list comes out. Thanks for
Well,
telling us all about it, Lindy.
yes, you can count on me for that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shawn. We'll talk again soon.
Absolutely.